God says, it is time to say goodbye. If you are still holding on to something that has already finished holding on to you, stay with this. Do not close it yet. Something specific already surfaced the moment you read that sentence. A person. A version of yourself. A belief you have outgrown but never formally released. Whatever it is, it arrived instantly, almost against your will, because some part of you already knows this particular goodbye has been overdue for some time now. Breathe. Let your shoulders drop. Whatever defenses you have built around continuing to hold this particular thing, set them down for a few minutes. This message deserves your full attention. Archangel Michael is not asking you to say goodbye to everything in your life today. He is asking you to examine one specific thing, honestly, and consider whether it has already quietly ended, even though you have not yet allowed yourself to acknowledge that ending clearly. Here is how you will know if this message is speaking directly to you. Ask yourself a simple question. Is there something in my life I am still carrying, still explaining, still defending, that has actually already stopped serving me? Not something that might stop serving you eventually. Something that has already stopped, quietly, while you continue treating it as though it remains exactly as valuable and necessary as it once was. If something specific came to mind immediately, this message is for you. Consider what makes goodbye so difficult, even when the thing being released has genuinely already run its course. Familiarity feels safer than uncertainty, even when familiarity has become genuinely costly. The known difficulty of continuing to hold something often feels more manageable than the unknown difficulty of finally releasing it, even when releasing it would ultimately serve you far better. This is not weakness. It is simply how the mind tends to protect itself, clinging to what is known rather than risking what remains uncertain. But protection, when it outlives its actual usefulness, starts working against you rather than for you. Think about a specific past instance in your own life when you finally released something difficult, something that initially felt impossible to imagine living without, only to discover, eventually, that life continued forward in ways you could not have anticipated while still holding on. That memory, if it exists, offers genuine, personal evidence that survival and even growth remain possible on the other side of this kind of significant release, regardless of how impossible that outcome might currently feel from where you presently stand. Here is something worth understanding about what this particular goodbye might actually involve, since it may not look like what you initially expect. It might mean finally releasing a relationship that has already quietly ended in every way except the official acknowledgement of that ending. It might mean releasing an old version of yourself, one built around circumstances or beliefs that no longer genuinely fit who you have become. It might mean releasing a specific dream you have been holding onto out of stubbornness rather than genuine, continued conviction that it still fits your life. Whichever specific thing this message is speaking to, notice honestly whether you have already sensed its ending, even while continuing to resist naming it clearly. Consider how long you have actually sensed this particular ending, even if only vaguely, even if you have not previously allowed yourself to name it this directly. Weeks. Months. Perhaps considerably longer. This honest accounting itself often reveals how genuinely overdue this particular acknowledgement has actually become. Consider the specific cost of continuing to hold on to something that has already ended in every meaningful way except your own acknowledgement. Energy spent maintaining something that no longer genuinely nourishes you. Emotional space occupied by something that could otherwise be available for something new, something more aligned with who you are actually becoming. This cost accumulates quietly, day after day, easy to overlook in any single moment but significant when considered across an extended period of continued holding. Consider, too, what specific opportunities may have already quietly passed by while your attention and energy remained fixed on maintaining this particular attachment, opportunities that might have been noticed and pursued had that same attention and energy been genuinely available instead. Here is something Archangel Michael wants you to understand about the difference between genuine patience and simple avoidance disguised as patience. Genuine patience continues to hold something because there remains real, ongoing value in doing so, even amid genuine difficulty. Avoidance disguised as patience continues to hold something purely out of fear of what releasing it might require, long after any genuine value has actually disappeared. Consider honestly which of these two categories actually applies to whatever specific thing this message has helped you identify. This distinction matters considerably, since one deserves continued commitment while the other deserves honest release. Think about how you would distinguish these two categories in someone else's life, someone you cared about, observed from outside their own particular attachment and emotional investment. Would you tell them their continued holding reflected wise, genuine patience, or would you gently suggest that avoidance might actually be the more accurate description? This outside perspective, applied honestly to your own situation, often reveals clarity that direct, internal reflection alone sometimes struggles to access. Here is something worth sitting with quietly for a moment. There is a very specific reason this message reached you today rather than any other day. Something recently happened, something small, perhaps something you have not even fully registered as significant, that finally created enough clarity for this particular truth to surface. Think back over the last several days. A conversation. A quiet realization during an ordinary moment. A specific feeling that arose and then was quickly dismissed. Something recent connects directly to whatever this message is asking you to finally release. Do not rush past this. Let yourself actually remember it. Try to recall the specific circumstances surrounding that moment, where you were, what was happening around you, what specifically triggered that flicker of recognition before it was quickly set aside again. This kind of specific, sensory recollection often helps anchor the memory more firmly, making it easier to genuinely engage with rather than allowing it to remain a vague, half-remembered impression already fading from conscious awareness. Here is something worth understanding about fear specifically, since fear likely underlies whatever hesitation has kept you from acknowledging this particular ending until now. Fear that releasing this thing means admitting failure. Fear that letting go proves you were wrong to have held on this long in the first place. Fear that once you finally release it, you will discover regret, wishing you had held on just a little longer. These fears are understandable. They are also, more often than not, simply fear speaking, not truth. Consider examining each of these specific fears individually, rather than allowing them to remain bundled together as one overwhelming, undifferentiated resistance. Fear of admitting failure often dissolves somewhat once you recognize that most endings do not actually reflect failure at all, but simply the natural conclusion of a chapter that has run its genuine course. Fear of proving yourself wrong to have held on this long often softens once you recognize that readiness develops gradually, meaning earlier timing would not necessarily have been genuinely available even had you wanted it to be. Fear of eventual regret often eases once you recognize that continued holding, when something has already ended, tends to produce far more regret over time than honest, timely release ever does. Ask yourself honestly whether continuing to hold this particular thing has actually been working. Not whether it once worked, years ago, when it first began. Whether it is genuinely working now, in your actual present circumstances, exactly as they currently exist. If the honest answer is no, that honesty itself is worth taking seriously. Consider, too, what specifically has changed between when this particular thing genuinely served you and now, when it apparently no longer does. Understanding this specific shift, rather than leaving it vague and unexamined, can help you trust your own honest assessment more fully, rather than continuing to doubt whether your sense that something has genuinely changed is actually accurate. Here is something that might surprise you, arriving now, in the middle of this particular reflection, something not originally planned when this message began. Archangel Michael has something specific to add. He says this: "The goodbye you are being asked to consider is not actually the ending it appears to be. It is the opening of something you have not yet allowed yourself to imagine, because your attention has remained entirely fixed on what would be lost rather than what might finally become possible." Sit with that for a moment before continuing. This does not mean the goodbye will be easy, or painless, or without genuine grief attached to it. It simply means that what lies beyond this particular ending has not yet been given fair consideration, crowded out entirely by continued focus on the difficulty of releasing what currently exists. Consider deliberately shifting even a small portion of your attention, right now, toward what genuinely might become possible once this particular release has occurred, rather than allowing every ounce of attention to remain fixed exclusively on the difficulty of the ending itself. This does not require abandoning honest acknowledgement of genuine loss. It simply means allowing a more complete, balanced picture to develop, one that includes both what is ending and what might genuinely begin. Here is something worth understanding about grief, since genuine goodbye typically requires genuine grief, even when the thing being released has clearly already run its course and no longer serves you. Grief does not indicate the goodbye was wrong. It simply reflects that something once mattered, and mattering, even after its season has ended, deserves to be honored through the process of genuine, honest grieving rather than dismissed or rushed past entirely. Give yourself permission to grieve, even while also giving yourself permission to finally release. Think about what genuine grieving might actually look like for you personally, given your own particular way of processing loss and transition. For some people, this involves quiet, private reflection. For others, it involves sharing openly with trusted people, or expressing through writing, art, or other creative outlets. Whatever form genuine grieving takes for you specifically, honor it fully, rather than rushing past it toward premature, forced resolution. Here is something practical worth considering, since this message is not suggesting reckless, impulsive release taken without any genuine thought or care. If your particular goodbye involves a relationship, consider what an honest, respectful conversation might look like, rather than either continuing indefinite ambiguity or ending things abruptly without any genuine acknowledgement or closure. If it involves an old version of yourself, consider what small, symbolic action might help you genuinely mark this particular transition, something private and meaningful, chosen specifically by you. If it involves a dream you have outgrown, consider what it would mean to release it consciously, with gratitude for what it once represented, rather than continuing to carry it forward simply out of guilt or stubbornness. Here is something worth understanding about timing, since this message is not demanding immediate, dramatic action within the next several minutes. It is simply asking you to finally, honestly acknowledge what you already sense to be true, allowing that acknowledgement to begin informing your subsequent choices, even if those choices unfold gradually over the coming days and weeks rather than instantly, all at once, today. Consider what one small, honest step toward this particular goodbye might look like, something manageable enough to actually begin, rather than something so large and dramatic it simply gets postponed indefinitely out of overwhelm. Think about the smallest possible version of that step, smaller even than what first came to mind. Sometimes the most immediately achievable action feels almost too modest to matter, yet these smaller starting points often prove far more sustainable than larger, more intimidating steps that end up postponed simply because of their perceived scale and difficulty. Here is something worth naming honestly about doubt, since doubt likely arose at some point during this reflection, questioning whether this message genuinely applies to your own particular situation. Consider whether that doubt reflects careful, honest evaluation, or whether it reflects the same avoidance this message has been describing throughout, quietly protecting you from acknowledging something you already sense to be true. Here is something further Archangel Michael wants to add, arriving again, unplanned, insistent. He says this specifically. You already know exactly what this message has been pointing toward. You knew it within the first several sentences. Everything since then has simply been you deciding whether you are finally ready to admit it fully, to yourself, honestly, without continued deflection. Are you ready? Only you know the true answer to that question. Notice, too, that readiness does not need to feel like complete confidence in order to be genuine. It might feel more like exhaustion with the alternative, a quiet recognition that continuing to avoid this particular truth has become more tiring than finally facing it directly. That kind of readiness counts just as much as the more dramatic, confident version might. Here is something worth understanding about support during this particular process, since navigating genuine goodbye, especially regarding something significant, often benefits from additional perspective beyond what purely private reflection alone can fully provide. Consider whether a trusted friend, someone capable of offering honest, caring perspective, might help you process whatever specific goodbye this message has helped you identify. If professional support feels relevant, particularly if grief connected to this particular release feels significant, consider this a legitimate, valuable resource rather than something to be avoided out of unnecessary pride or hesitation. Think about what specific qualities would make someone genuinely helpful during this particular process, whether a trusted friend or a professional, ideally someone who can offer genuine presence without either minimizing the genuine difficulty involved or pressuring you toward premature resolution before you feel authentically ready. Consider the specific role that identity plays throughout this particular process, since whatever you are being asked to release has likely become woven, at least partially, into how you understand yourself. If this particular relationship, belief, or dream has existed for a long time, releasing it may feel like releasing a piece of your own identity, not simply an external circumstance separate from who you actually are. This is worth naming honestly, since identity-level attachment often explains why certain endings feel considerably more difficult than their surface-level significance might initially suggest. If you have been the person defined by this particular relationship, this particular role, or this particular pursuit for a long time, releasing it genuinely requires discovering, or rediscovering, who you are beneath and beyond that specific identity. This discovery process takes time. Extend yourself genuine patience throughout it, rather than expecting immediate clarity about who you are once this particular attachment has been released. Reflect on who you were before this particular thing became so central to your identity. What genuine interests, values, and qualities existed independently of it, waiting quietly to be reconnected with once this particular attachment finally loosens its hold. This earlier version of yourself has not disappeared. It has simply been quiet, patient, waiting for renewed space and attention. Think about one specific quality or interest from that earlier version of yourself, something worth deliberately reconnecting with as this particular release continues unfolding. This does not need to happen immediately or perfectly. It simply offers a gentle, concrete direction to move toward as the space this attachment once occupied gradually opens up again. Here is something worth understanding about the specific role other people might play in either supporting or complicating this particular goodbye. Some people in your life may genuinely understand and support this release, having perhaps already sensed its necessity themselves, even before you were ready to name it clearly. Others may resist, whether out of genuine concern, or out of their own discomfort with change, or simply because your continued holding on has served some purpose within their own life or relationship with you that they are not eager to lose. Consider honestly which people in your life fall into each of these categories, since this awareness can help you navigate this particular transition with appropriate wisdom, seeking support from those genuinely capable of offering it, while remaining appropriately discerning about input from those whose resistance may reflect their own needs rather than genuine concern for your actual well-being. Think about a specific person who genuinely falls into the supportive category, someone you might reach out to as you continue this particular process. Consider, too, a specific person whose input might currently require more careful, discerning evaluation, without necessarily needing to distance yourself from them entirely, simply recognizing that their perspective on this particular matter may not be entirely objective given their own stake in the outcome. Here is something worth understanding about the specific timeline this particular goodbye might reasonably require, since expecting instant, complete release often produces unnecessary additional discouragement when that expectation inevitably proves unrealistic. Genuine release, particularly regarding something that has held significant space in your life for an extended period, typically unfolds gradually, through repeated moments of choosing release over continued attachment, rather than through one single, complete, permanent decision made once and never revisited. This does not mean the initial acknowledgement does not matter. It matters significantly, representing the necessary beginning of a process that will likely continue unfolding gradually over subsequent weeks and months. Give yourself permission for this gradual unfolding, rather than requiring instant, complete resolution within a single day or even a single week. Consider setting a realistic, gentle expectation for yourself regarding this particular timeline, perhaps checking in with yourself after several weeks rather than expecting complete transformation within days. This kind of realistic pacing tends to support genuine, lasting release far more effectively than impatient, unrealistic expectations that inevitably produce discouragement when they are not met on schedule. Here is something further Archangel Michael wants to add, arriving once more, unplanned, insistent, refusing to remain unmentioned even as this reflection continues toward its eventual close. He says this: there is a specific fear underneath everything else already discussed throughout this message, a fear that has not yet been named directly, even though it has been quietly shaping your resistance to this particular goodbye all along. That fear is this: you are afraid that releasing this thing means admitting the time and effort you already invested into it was wasted. Sit with that for a moment. Notice whether it lands as true. Here is something worth understanding directly about this specific fear, since it deserves direct, honest examination rather than continued, unexamined operation in the background of your ongoing hesitation. Time and effort invested into something that has since run its course was not wasted simply because that particular chapter has now ended. It contributed to who you have become, to lessons genuinely learned, to growth genuinely achieved, none of which disappears simply because the specific container that originally held that growth is now ready to be released. Consider what you have genuinely gained through whatever this message is asking you to release, gains that remain entirely yours regardless of whether the specific relationship, belief, or dream itself continues forward or not. Naming these gains explicitly can help release the fear that letting go somehow erases or invalidates everything that came before this particular moment of ending. Try naming at least 3 specific things you genuinely gained, whether skills, insights, memories, or simply a clearer sense of what you actually want and need. Let these specific gains remain firmly with you, entirely separate from whatever specific outcome eventually happens to the thing itself that is now being released. Here is something worth understanding about celebration, since genuine goodbye, paradoxically, sometimes deserves a measure of genuine celebration alongside whatever grief also accompanies it. Consider what specifically deserves celebration regarding this particular chapter now coming to its close, whether specific memories worth genuine gratitude, specific growth genuinely achieved, or simply the courage it has taken to finally acknowledge that this particular ending has arrived. This celebration does not deny genuine difficulty or genuine loss. It simply holds space for gratitude alongside grief, recognizing that both can coexist honestly within the same significant transition, rather than requiring you to choose exclusively between pure celebration or pure mourning. Consider what small, private way you might genuinely mark this particular transition, honoring both what it cost you and what it gave you simultaneously. Perhaps writing a brief letter to yourself, never meant to be sent anywhere, simply capturing honestly what this chapter meant and why it is now, finally, ready to close. Perhaps a small, symbolic action, lighting a candle, taking a quiet walk, doing something that feels meaningful specifically to you, marking this moment as genuinely significant rather than letting it pass by unacknowledged the way so many important transitions unfortunately do. Here is something worth understanding about what comes next, once this particular goodbye has genuinely been acknowledged and begun, even if complete release continues unfolding gradually over subsequent weeks. Space that was previously occupied by this particular attachment does not remain empty indefinitely. It gradually fills with something new, something that could not have entered while this particular space remained fully occupied by what is now being released. Consider what you genuinely hope might eventually fill this particular space, allowing yourself to imagine this possibility, even tentatively, even without complete certainty about exactly what it will ultimately look like. This imagining itself can provide valuable, sustaining motivation throughout the more difficult stretches of this particular release process. Picture, as specifically as you genuinely can, what your life might feel like once this particular space has genuinely opened and begun filling with something new. Not necessarily a specific, concrete outcome, but simply a general sense of lightness, possibility, and renewed capacity that this eventual release might make available to you, once fully realized. Here is a final significant consideration before this message moves toward its close. This goodbye, whatever specific form it takes in your own particular life, does not diminish what once was. It simply honors that what once was has completed its season, making room, deliberately and consciously, for whatever comes next. Release whatever shame might accompany this particular ending. Endings are not failures. They are simply part of how life continues moving forward, one season giving way to the next, even when that transition requires genuine courage and genuine grief along the way. Consider where this particular shame may have first developed, whether from specific messages absorbed earlier in life suggesting that endings always reflect personal failure, or simply from your own harsh internal standards regarding what should have lasted longer or turned out differently. Naming this origin can help loosen shame's grip, even slightly, even today, allowing you to approach this particular goodbye with considerably more self-compassion than shame alone would otherwise permit. Before this message reaches its true close, take one final, quiet moment. Name, specifically, whatever this message has helped you identify as ready for goodbye. Notice, honestly, whether you feel ready to begin that particular process, even imperfectly, even gradually, starting today. This does not need to feel dramatic. It simply needs to feel true. Take one more moment here, before continuing forward. Place a hand gently over your chest if that feels comfortable. Breathe slowly. Let whatever you have named settle fully, without rushing toward the next thought or the next task waiting for your attention once this reflection ends. Trust that this message reached you today for a genuine reason, connecting specifically to something real within your own particular life, rather than arriving randomly. Something in you recognized enough significance to continue reading this far. Consider what it might mean to continue holding this particular goodbye gently in the coming days, allowing the process to unfold at whatever pace it genuinely requires, rather than forcing either premature resolution or continued indefinite postponement. Think about what gentleness would actually look like for you specifically during this particular period, perhaps extra patience with yourself, perhaps additional rest, perhaps simply permission to feel whatever arises without immediately needing to fix, explain, or resolve it completely. Reflect on how you will handle moments of doubt or renewed attachment that are likely to arise as you continue this process, moments when old patterns attempt to reassert themselves, insisting once again that holding on remains the better choice. These moments do not indicate that your original clarity was mistaken. They simply reflect how genuinely significant this particular release actually is. When those moments arise, return to this reflection. Return to whatever felt most true during this initial reading. Let it reinforce your continued commitment, even as its initial emotional intensity naturally softens with time. Consider what specific record you might keep as you continue this process, brief notes capturing whatever shifts or developments occur, evidence you can return to later, once this particular goodbye has fully unfolded and whatever comes next has finally had space to begin. This record does not need to be elaborate or formal. Even a few honest sentences, written occasionally as this process continues, can offer valuable perspective later, allowing you to look back and genuinely recognize how far this particular journey has actually carried you, evidence that can be difficult to fully appreciate through memory alone. There is one more layer worth adding before this message truly comes to its close, something practical that ties everything shared today into sustained, meaningful engagement over the coming weeks ahead, ensuring this genuine acknowledgement actually translates into lasting release rather than remaining simply another moment of temporary insight quickly forgotten once ordinary daily demands reassert themselves. Consider what specific weekly practice might help you continue processing this particular goodbye, something brief and sustainable rather than elaborate and likely to be abandoned once initial motivation naturally diminishes over time. Perhaps a specific evening each week, honestly reflecting on how this particular release continues unfolding, noticing what has shifted, what remains difficult, and what small steps feel appropriate for the week ahead. Reflect on what specific evidence of genuine progress you might reasonably look for over the coming months, evidence that would help confirm authentic release is actually occurring, even when that release unfolds gradually rather than through one single, dramatic moment of complete resolution. Perhaps a growing capacity to think about this particular chapter with less intensity, less immediate emotional charge, even while genuine memories and feelings remain present. Perhaps specific new space beginning to open in your daily life, filled gradually with different priorities, different relationships, or different pursuits that could not have found room while this particular attachment remained fully occupying that space. Consider, too, what specific role continued self-compassion plays as you develop this particular release, since old attachment, especially attachment developed and reinforced over an extended period, does not typically dissolve entirely through a single moment of recognition like this reflection alone. If old patterns of clinging or resistance resurface periodically, even after this particular message, meet them with patience rather than harsh self-criticism, recognizing that genuine release of this kind typically develops gradually, through repeated, gentle practice over time. Explore what specific conversations you might need to have with people close to you as this particular release continues developing, whether sharing with a trusted friend that you are working through this specific goodbye, or having specific conversations connected directly to whatever or whoever this particular release actually involves. When and if the timing eventually feels appropriate for that kind of direct communication. Consider what specific boundaries might genuinely support this particular process, recognizing that releasing something significant sometimes requires temporary or permanent distance from reminders, situations, or even certain people connected closely to what is being released, at least until the release itself has had sufficient time to genuinely stabilize and settle. Reflect, too, on what specific self-talk patterns you want to consciously cultivate as you continue this particular journey, replacing whatever harsh, dismissive internal narrative may have previously accompanied your hesitation or your eventual decision to release, with language that honors both the genuine significance of what once was and the genuine wisdom of finally allowing this particular chapter to conclude. Consider what it would mean to view this particular goodbye as part of an ongoing, natural rhythm present throughout every meaningful life, rather than an isolated, unusual event requiring permanent, singular focus. Endings and beginnings continue occurring throughout every human life, and developing genuine capacity to navigate them with honesty and grace, rather than either premature dismissal or prolonged, unnecessary clinging, represents genuine, valuable wisdom that will continue serving you well throughout whatever future transitions eventually arise as well. Consider, finally, what genuine gratitude might look like throughout this continued process, not gratitude that denies genuine grief or difficulty, but gratitude that exists honestly alongside both, perhaps gratitude for whatever this particular chapter genuinely gave you during its actual season. Perhaps gratitude for the courage it has taken to finally acknowledge its ending. Perhaps simply gratitude for your own continued willingness to grow, even when growth requires genuinely difficult, courageous release. Here is one final consideration worth holding as this reflection continues toward its true close. Archangel Michael has one last addition, arriving now, in these final moments, something that has been waiting quietly throughout this entire reflection for exactly this specific point to finally be spoken. He says this: "The goodbye you are being asked to make today is not actually as final as it currently feels. Some things, once genuinely released rather than merely suppressed, eventually return in an entirely different, healthier form, at exactly the right time, though that timing rarely matches what you might currently expect or hope for. This does not mean clinging to false hope that circumstances will simply reverse themselves without any genuine change or growth on your part. It means trusting that genuine release, done honestly and completely, often creates exactly the conditions needed for something meaningful to eventually develop, whether connected to what was released or entirely new and unexpected instead. Consider what it would mean to release this particular attachment fully, without needing complete certainty about exactly what comes next, trusting instead that genuine, honest release itself represents the necessary and sufficient step required right now, regardless of whatever specific outcome eventually unfolds from it. This message reached you today for a reason. Trust that. Carry it with you. And when you are ready, not before, not because anyone told you to, but when you are genuinely ready, take your next step. Deep down, you already know what that step is. Thank you for receiving this message today. Be gentle with yourself as you continue this particular goodbye, one honest, patient step at a time.